The telephone rang 3 times before Audrey Hepburn answered it. When she hung up 60 seconds later, she knew her life had just changed forever. The voice on the other end had told her something that would force her to choose between her career and her conscience. And everyone in Hollywood was about to find out which mattered more to her. But to understand why that phone call terrified the most graceful woman in Hollywood, you need to know what happened 2 weeks earlier in a cramped dressing room at NBC Studios. October 15th, 1953. New York City was drowning in autumn rain, the kind that turns sidewalks into mirrors and makes even the most beautiful woman look like a drowned cat. But not Audrey Hepburn. Somehow, she managed to arrive at the studio looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine, her dark hair perfectly coiffed, her simple black coat making every other woman in the building feel overdressed. She was there to appear on a television variety show, one of forgettable programs that filled the airwaves between the real entertainment. A quick interview, a charming smile, a few questions about her latest film. Standard publicity work that every star endured. What she didn't expect was to meet Margaret Sullivan backstage. Margaret had been a star once, a real star, the kind whose name could fill theaters and whose face sold magazines. But that was 15 years ago. Before the drinking, before the scandal, before Hollywood decided she was too difficult, too unpredictable, too damaged to be worth the risk. Now she was 43 years old and working as a script girl on a television variety show, invisible, forgotten. Audrey found her in the women's dressing room, sitting in front of a cracked mirror, carefully applying lipstick with hands that shook slightly. She was still beautiful, in the way that broken things sometimes are, but the beauty was fragile now, held together by pride and careful makeup. "Miss Sullivan," Audrey said, quietly, "I wanted to say hello. I was a great admirer of your work in the shop around the corner." Margaret looked up, and for just a moment something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, not of Audrey, but of what Audrey represented. Youth. Promise. Everything Margaret had once been. "Audrey Hepburn," Margaret said, and her voice still had that trained theatrical quality that had once made audiences lean forward in their seats. "The new Golden Girl." It wasn't said with malice, exactly, but it wasn't kind either. "I just wanted to tell you," Audrey continued, "that performance influenced me greatly when I was starting out." Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Influenced you? Darling, I doubt you remember a thing about that film. You were what, 10 years old when it came out?" 14, Audrey said quietly. "And I remember every scene." Something in her tone made Margaret look at her more carefully. Really look at her, not just at the symbol of her own lost youth, but at the person standing there. "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret asked. Audrey hesitated. The truth was complicated. She had grown up during the war, when movies were one of the few escapes from the horror outside. Margaret Sullivan's performances had given her hope during the darkest times, but she also recognized something else in the older woman's face, the fear that every actress in Hollywood carried, the knowledge that fame was temporary, that youth faded, that one day you could be on top and the next day you could be forgotten. "Because," Audrey said carefully, "I think people should be remembered for their best work, not their worst moments." Margaret stared at her for a long moment, then unexpectedly she smiled, a real smile, not the bitter one from before. "You're different from what I expected," she said. "Most stars your age are too busy looking ahead to look back." "I'm not most stars," Audrey said simply. And that was how an unlikely friendship began. Over the next 2 weeks, Audrey found herself seeking out Margaret's company whenever they were both at the studio. Margaret was still sharp, still intelligent, still full of insights about acting and life, and the peculiar cruelty of an industry that chewed up women and spit them out. They would sit in Margaret's tiny office, drinking coffee from paper cups and talking about everything except the obvious, that Margaret was slowly dying of loneliness and irrelevance, and that Audrey was just beginning a journey that might end the same way. Margaret never asked Audrey for anything, never hinted that she needed help or suggested that Audrey could use her influence to get Margaret better work. She maintained her dignity even as her circumstances crumbled around her, which made what happened next so much more devastating. On October 29th, Audrey arrived at the studio to find Margaret's office empty. Not just empty of Margaret, but completely cleaned out. The personal photos were gone. The coffee cup she always used was gone. Even the small plant on her windowsill was gone. "Where's Margaret?" Audrey asked the first person she saw. "Margaret Sullivan? She was let go yesterday," the man said without looking up from his clipboard. "Budget cuts. They're trimming the older staff." Budget cuts. As if Margaret Sullivan, who had once commanded $50,000 per picture, was now just an expense to be eliminated. Audrey stood in that empty office, staring at the desk where Margaret had sat just the day before, and felt something shift inside her chest. Anger, yes, but also a kind of terror, because she was seeing her own possible future in that cleaned-out room. She tried calling Margaret at home. No answer. She tried again the next day, and the next. Finally, she drove to Margaret's apartment building, a shabby place on the Upper East Side that had probably been elegant once. The building superintendent, a gruff man with paint under his fingernails, looked at her suspiciously when she asked about Margaret. "You're the movie star, ain't you?" he said. "Yeah, she talked about you. Said you were different from the others." "Is she here?" Audrey asked. He shook his head. "Moved out 3 days ago. Couldn't make rent. Took whatever she could carry and left the rest." "Do you know where she went?" "Nah, but she left this for you." He handed Audrey a sealed envelope with her name written on it in Margaret's careful handwriting. Audrey waited until she was back in her car before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small newspaper clipping. The letter was brief. "Dear Audrey, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Don't try to find me. It's better this way. I wanted you to know that our conversations these past weeks meant more to me than you could possibly understand. You reminded me of why I fell in love with acting in the first place. I'm enclosing a clipping from today's paper. You should read it carefully. There are some battles worth fighting, even when you know you can't win. Thank you for seeing me when everyone else stopped looking. Margaret." The newspaper clipping was small, buried on page 6 of the entertainment section. The headline read, "Studio System Under Fire, Anonymous Letter Details Systematic Abuse of Aging Female Stars." Audrey read the article twice before the full meaning hit her. Someone, and she was now certain it was Margaret, had written to the newspapers exposing the way studios discarded older actresses, the way women who had given their lives to the industry were pushed aside when they were no longer young enough to be profitable. The article quoted extensively from the anonymous letter, which detailed specific instances of age discrimination, of talented women being forced into poverty because they were no longer considered marketable. It was devastating in its precision and heartbreaking in its honesty, and it was going to cause an earthquake in Hollywood. The phone call came 3 days later at 11:47 p.m. Audrey was in her apartment still thinking about Margaret, still wondering where she had gone. "Miss Hepburn?" The voice was male, unfamiliar, official. "This is Detective Morrison with the NYPD. I'm calling about Margaret Sullivan." Audrey's blood turned to ice. "What about her?" "She was found this afternoon in a hotel room downtown." "I'm afraid she's dead, miss. Apparent suicide. She left a note with your name in it. Said you were the only person who'd been kind to her recently. We need someone to identify the body." The words hit Audrey like physical blows. Margaret was dead. Margaret, who had been brilliant and funny and kind, who had shared her wisdom and her coffee, and her increasingly desperate hope that things might get better. "Miss Hepburn, are you there?" "Yes," Audrey managed. "Yes, I'll come." The next few hours passed in a blur of police stations and paperwork and the terrible finality of seeing Margaret's body lying still on a metal table. The woman who had once brought joy to millions of people, reduced to a case number and a signature on a form. But the worst part was the note Margaret had left. The detective handed it to Audrey in a sealed envelope, and she read it sitting in the front seat of her car outside the morgue. "Audrey, if you're reading this, then my plan worked and you're the one they called. I'm sorry to burden you with this, but I needed someone to know the truth. I wrote that letter to the newspapers. I exposed what they're doing to women like me, women who gave everything to this industry and got nothing back when we needed help most. I thought if people knew, if they understood, maybe something would change. But I'm not brave enough to stay and see what happens next. The shame is too much, and I'm too tired to keep fighting. You're different, Audrey. You have something the rest of us never had. You have genuine kindness. Don't let them take that away from you. Don't let them make you hard. And please, if anyone asks about that letter, tell them the truth. Tell them why I wrote it. Tell them about all of us who got forgotten. I'm sorry for leaving you with this burden, but I trust you to carry it better than I could, Margaret." Audrey sat in her car outside the morgue, holding Margaret's final words, and realized that her life had just taken a turn she never could have anticipated. Margaret had made her the keeper of a secret that could destroy careers, topple studio executives, and change Hollywood forever. The letter Margaret had written was already causing chaos. Studio heads were demanding investigations, lawyers were making threats, and somewhere in the system there were people who knew Margaret Sullivan had been the source, and they were looking for anyone who might have been connected to her, which brought Audrey back to this moment. Sitting in her apartment at nearly midnight, holding a dead woman's confession, knowing that tomorrow she would have to decide what to do with the most dangerous information in Hollywood, she could remain silent, pretend she'd never known Margaret, never read the letter, never understood the systematic cruelty that had driven a brilliant woman to suicide. It would be easier, safer. It would protect her career and her reputation and her future. Or she could honor Margaret's final request. She could tell the truth about what happened to aging actresses in Hollywood. She could use her fame and her platform to expose a system that discarded women like used tissues when they were no longer profitable. It would probably destroy her career. Studio executives didn't appreciate stars who bit the hand that fed them. They had ways of making troublemakers disappear, just as they had made Margaret disappear. But Margaret had trusted her with this burden for a reason. She had seen something in Audrey that even Audrey wasn't sure she possessed: the courage to do the right thing even when it cost everything. Audrey looked at herself in the mirror across the room. She saw the face that had launched a career, the delicate features that photographed so beautifully, the eyes that had charmed audiences around the world. And she realized that none of that mattered if she couldn't look at that face with respect. The next morning, Audrey Hepburn called a press conference. She stood in front of 50 reporters and photographers and told them about Margaret Sullivan, about their friendship, about Margaret's talent, about the letter she had written exposing Hollywood's treatment of older actresses. She told them about the note Margaret had left, about the desperation that had driven a brilliant woman to suicide. She told them that Margaret Sullivan deserved to be remembered not as a casualty of the studio system, but as someone brave enough to speak the truth even when it cost her everything. The room was dead silent when she finished. Then slowly, hands began to rise, questions were shouted, cameras flashed, and Audrey Hepburn began the most important performance of her life, playing herself, standing up for a friend who could no longer stand up for herself. The fallout was immediate and devastating. 2 studio executives resigned within a week. 3 major stars came forward with their own stories of age discrimination. Labor laws were changed. Pension plans were established. And Audrey Hepburn, who had risked everything to tell the truth, found that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is also the most necessary. Margaret Sullivan was buried on a gray November morning in a cemetery in Queens. Audrey was the only person from the entertainment industry who attended the funeral. As she stood by the grave, watching them lower Margaret's casket into the ground, Audrey made a promise. She would never let the industry forget that behind every beautiful face was a human being who deserved dignity, respect, and care. Not just when they were young and profitable, but always. It was a promise that would define the rest of her career and the rest of her life. Because sometimes, the most important phone call you can answer is the one that asks you who you really are when everything is on the line. And Audrey Hepburn had answered.